Would you like to turn back in your Bibles to the book of Hebrews? And our actual passage is going to be chapter 12 and verses 1 to 4. So Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 4. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Imagine yourself in an ancient library and reaching for a book that catches your eye. You open it up and the pages automatically fall open to where there's a letter tucked inside of it between the leaves. And so, intrigued by your find, you pick the letter out and you read it. And you find it contains some really interesting stuff. But then, having read it, you're curious as to who the writer is and to who the recipients were. But your curiosity is piqued because missing from the letter is both the name of the person who wrote it and to the people he wrote it to. Now, in your reading the contents of the letter, you've noticed that the writer knows the recipients very well, and vice versa. But who the writer is and where he wrote from is as much a mystery as who the recipients are and where they were living. And that, in a nutshell, is how the book of Hebrews comes to us. From its earliest manuscripts, the letter is headed to the Hebrews. But who and where those Hebrews were, and who the writer was, and where the writer was when he wrote the letter, has since been a mystery to the church. It's one that's yet to be solved. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, it's the contents of the letter that matters most. And the close reading of the contents of Hebrews reveals to us that some of these first century Jewish Christians, these Hebrews, were struggling in their walk of faith. And that's something that's very evident when you read this letter. And it explains why the writer wrote this magnificent treatise to them, because he wrote it to both warn them and to encourage them to persevere, both of which elements are deeply woven into his writing. But just so that we can try to envisage their situation, remember, these were people of the book. These were people of the Old Testament covenant. These were Hebrews, Jews, who had now become Christians. These were people who, for years, had lived by the law of God, and who for centuries had worshipped in the temple of Jerusalem. People who for centuries had offered up their sacrifices morning and evening, and who were regulated by the ceremonial demands of the Old Testament law. But now, suddenly, in their lives, abruptly, in the life and death of Jesus Christ, all of those centuries of Old Testament covenantal regulations became abrogated. They were brought to an end. And they were brought to an end in Christ's death, because he finalized all of those things that the Old Testament pointed to him in his sacrifice. But nevertheless, for the mass of unsaved Jews, still worship in the temple went on. Priests performed their duties. Sacrifices were still being offered. And what's more, these Christian Jews who had believed Jesus as the new way, these were now being ostracized and persecuted by those who believed in the old way. And as they suffered loss of property and position in their lives, they struggled. Some were turning back. Some lacked perseverance. Some were already guilty of total apostasy from the true faith. And so this unknown writer to us wrote to these people who he knew well, therefore to encourage them to persevere in the way of faith. Now, broadly speaking, that's the background to the letter of the Hebrews. And broadly speaking, the letter is as applicable today as it was then in the first century. And that's because, like those early Christians and their forebears, their lives, like our lives, are essentially lived by faith, not by sight. And the writer tells us clearly that that's the case in the first verse of chapter 11. He says, faith, what these people are marked for. Faith is being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you do not see. And so let's look then at this exhortation to persevere in faith that the writer to the Hebrews has for us. And we'll do that by focusing just on the first verse of this chapter this morning. And there he says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Well, firstly then, let's look at this term, so great a cloud of witnesses. Who are they? What do they tell us? How do they affect us? And as I do that, I want to initially draw your attention to the first word in this verse. The word translated therefore or wherefore. Now, we've commented in the past about this important coupling word we often find in scriptures. And it's worth commenting again because these coupling words are very important to take notice of, these therefores. If we want to read, and if we want to get a proper understanding of what we're reading, we need to importantly consider context. What went before? What goes after we've been looking at? These therefore words that hook these things together. And here the context that precedes what the writer's about to say in chapter 12 and verse 1 is vitally linked to what he's just been saying in all of the 11th chapter. Now, just for a little Greek lesson, the writer could have used the word toy, which we would translate so then. He could have used the word gar, which we would translate for, or to wit. He could have used a very common word, which we generally go therefore. But instead he used the word toi garun. You see, he's collected all three of those together. And he's used this strong word to make sure that we see that what he's been saying in chapter 11 is foundational. And it's intimately connected with what he's going to say in chapter 12. So what's the link that the writer emphasizes that we must see? It's the link between his present recipients to their spiritual forebears. It's the link between them and the so great a cloud of witnesses that he speaks of. So who are this great cloud of witnesses? Verse 4, Abel, whose particular offering commended him as righteous. Verse 5, Enoch, who by his faith and his walk pleased God. Verse 7, Noah, who in holy fear believed God's word in an evil generation. Verse 8, Abraham, who forsook his home, his land, and everything to follow God. And who, verse 11, believed God and became the father of many nations. And verse 17, obeyed God in offering his son as a sacrifice. Who are these so great a cloud of witnesses? Verse 20, Isaac, 21, Jacob, 22, Joseph, 23, Moses' parents, 24, Moses, who, verse 26, regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of far greater value than the treasures of Egypt. Why? Why did he do that? Because he was looking ahead by faith to his reward. Who are these so great a cloud of witnesses? Joshua, Rahab, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the host of nameless others he speaks of as having suffered for their faith, but who persevered in their faith, looking to the end. Those like Abraham, verse 16, who were looking for a better country, a heavenly one. Those like Moses, verse 25, who chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. These commendable ones of faith, verse 39, who in their lifetime didn't receive what they promised but looked beyond their life for it. That's who this cloud of witnesses, those Old Testament believers who believed God's promise and who persevered to the end. So we might ask then, what links them? What did they have in common? Well, we could say the most important thing, the vital thing that linked them all, was that they set their eyes on Jesus. What the writer was going to say in the next verse. Or we could say that they set their eyes upon God's promised Saviour. Or that they set their eyes and their hearts upon the promise of Abraham's seed. Because all of these things are one and the same thing, said in different ways. It's the unbroken line which runs through the covenants from the Old Testament to the New Testament. It's God's promise to save sinners through faith in Jesus Christ, announced in the Old and fulfilled in the New. And that's what they all had in common. And that's what enabled them to endure suffering, scorn, and the world and its seducing pleasures. And that's what enabled them to persevere as aliens and strangers who were sure of what they hoped for and certain of what they could not see. Who were these great cloud of witnesses? They were people great and small, prophets and priests, kings and servants, prostitutes and adulterers, but all, with their imperfections and with their struggles, were changed in the course of their life by believing God's promise of salvation, and who therefore persevered in faith to the end. So that's what this great cloud of witnesses was, and what they had in common. They believed in the promise of God. They were believers. But then, I want to ask, why did the writer use this odd term, cloud of witnesses? And I think it's important to at least touch on this in passing. And that's because the term has given some people reason to think that the writer is saying, beyond the clouds are believers long passed by, who are from glory watching present believers as they run their race on earth. And sometimes people ask, don't they, can my husband or my wife or my son or my father, now in glory, can they see me from glory as I now run my race on earth? And in response to that, I think firstly I'd say that I don't think really that anyone can satisfactorily answer that question. And that's because simply the Bible doesn't tell us. And the closest that it gets to telling us of anything like that is here in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. But then, having said that, I think we can fairly positively say that that's not what the writer is saying in this verse. Now, probably the thought of past saints watching on is conjured up because of the word clouds and witnesses, because the clouds are heavenly and the witnesses must be now behind the clouds in heaven. But in actual fact, to speak of a cloud of witnesses, a cloud of people, was just a relatively common figure of speech, meaning a throng or a mass or a horde of people. For example, in Isaiah 60 and verse 8, speaking of that great mass that thronged to spiritual Zion, we read, "Who are these that fly along like clouds, like doves to their nests?" And there the picture of glory is painted of the countless multitudes thronging heaven. It's a foretaste, it's a preemption of what we'll read in Revelation chapter 7. Ezekiel uses a similar terminology. And then it was also an expression that was used outside of the Bible in earlier ages. So a cloud of people was a somewhat common figure of speech in days past of a horde or a throng of people. That's just how they spoke. But then tie that together with the so great a cloud, and immediately the emphasis is doubled. The cloud is a great throng, huge number of people. Here, it's the Old Testament believers who believed the promise. But then what about witnesses? Doesn't that imply people witnessing some passing event? That the throng is watching, that they're witnessing something? But again, I think that's to get things back to front. Because the term witness can be seen in two directions. It may be that they are spectators watching an event, or it may be that they are those who testify or witness by their lives to others. In other words, we are the spectators, and their lives of faith testify, witness to us. And that exactly fits our context. And it reinforces why the writer used such a strong connecting word to link chapter 11 with chapter 12. He's connecting the Old Testament believers' testimony of faith to what these New Testament believers ought to be doing themselves. And he's saying something like this: look at their lives. Look at how they lived and how they died. Look at their testimony of unwavering faith through hardship to the very end. Look at how, believing God's promises, they set their hearts beyond this world and persevered past it. And so the writer is encouraging his struggling friends to remember that they're not the only ones. They're not the only ones who have suffered for their faith as believers. And that many, many others, a great cloud of witnesses, have gone that way before and have begun to receive the award, just as you will if you don't faint and lose heart. What a tremendous encouragement that is for ourselves. To know that as we endure our daily trials, our sicknesses, our weaknesses, our declining health, all those things that tend to turn us inward and to think that we are the only ones who are suffering. What a great encouragement it is to know that many, many others, by the grace of God, have gone through the exact same things as we have and gone through to the end. In fact, that many have suffered far more than those in the day of this letter and ourselves have suffered. Because remember, he reminds them in verse 4 that in the struggle against sin, you have not resisted as yet unto the shedding of your blood, as our forebears have done. So that's our first point, this great cloud of witnesses. And so that leads us on to our second point, the race. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. And like Paul in Philippians 3, as we've been thinking in the past, this writer alludes to the Christian life as being a race or a contest. And the first thing he says to us is, shape up. Christian, shape up. That's what he says. And he says literally, lose the extra weight that's hindering you. And the tense is once and for all. He's saying, lose the flab. Get rid of it. Bid it farewell. And in his picture of an athlete in training, he's conveying a very profound spiritual truth. He's saying, Christian, to run the race before you as those before you have run it, you must once and for all put away everything that hinders your progress. Now the hindrance he's talking about, it's literally the word weight, is used only here in the New Testament, is an all-encompassing hindrance, but it's not all-inclusive. And what I mean by that is, what may be a hindrance for one person may not necessarily be the same for another. And so in this area of putting away the hindrance, that great axiom, know thyself, is paramount. That's what he's saying. Christian, know yourself. Know your weaknesses. Know the things that weigh you down spiritually and deal with it. Remove the weight. Remove the hindrance. Maybe today it's something like this. If your weakness, that which hinders you, is staying up all night Saturday, watching the television, so that you're likely to miss going to church on Sunday morning, or in crawling out of bed you turn up feeling dull and lethargic, unable to concentrate, pray and worship, then turn off the television. What's more important? Or if your time is consumed in some area or another, so that less and less time is given to reading the Bible and prayer, then change it. Where's your priority? Or if the pleasures of the world are so great, so as to blot out your desire for spiritual things and serving God, then lose them. What's lasting? What's passing? Or perhaps if following your beloved football club leaves you angry when they underperform, or angry when the umpire always sides with the other team. And Mum might have to say on some occasions, you better give Dad a bit of space for a while. And get your things in order. Get your priorities in order. Get rid of it. What really matters? And so the weight the writer is speaking of is anything that hinders your spiritual progress. Things not necessarily sinful in and of themselves, but things that draw you away from rather than draw you to Jesus Christ. Athletes, lose the weight. But then he speaks of the sin that so easily entangles. And again, he's using the athletic metaphor, in that in ancient games, it was common that participants would strip down to the bare minimum in order to perform. And a runner would wear absolutely nothing that would entangle him in his race. And again, the word that this man uses here is unusual, and that's only found here in the New Testament. And it implies something that clings to you, or is easily or constantly causes you to be entangled. It's close to you. It trips you up. It's something unlike the weight, which isn't all-inclusive and which isn't necessarily sinful in and of itself. Sin is sinful. It's sin of every category. Sin which clings to us. Sin which entangles us and hinders our progress in holiness. And in order to run unencumbered, we must put it away. It mustn't be allowed to entangle and frustrate our best performance. And so thirdly, to round off his athletic metaphor, the writer, having given us the example of those who had run the race before us, and having instructed us to put away all those things that hinder our progress, he now points us forward. And he says, let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Notice what he's saying there. He's saying we're on a marked out track. It's a particular word again he uses here. It's a circuit. It's a course. It's as if we're in a stadium and in a sense surrounded by those who participated before us. But then notice that he says the race or the course marked out for us. In other words, it's not a race we've chosen. It's not we who have elected the preferences and chosen the options we want. God has marked out our race for us. He providentially orders our lives. Again, the Apostle Paul said something very similar to this in writing to the Athenians, Acts chapter 17. He said this, for from one man, he, that is God, made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the times set for them and the exact places where they should live. Do you think that it's you who's chosen your life circumstances? Do you think that it's you who have ordered your events in life? Do you think that it's you who's chosen who you are and where you are? Did you choose your parents? Did you choose your upbringing? Did you choose your influences? Not according to Paul or this writer to the Hebrews. They say it was God. It was God who has marked out the course for us to run. I wonder when you lie back on your bed at night, sometimes when you're unable to sleep and you're thinking past your past life, and you look back and I'm sure you're able to say, I was running this course here. I was intending to do that. I'd ordered all things to that end. And then that came in. And that upset me. And that turned me. And when I wanted to go that way, I was turned to go that way. It was so frustrating at the time. But when you look back now, years later, you say, that was God. That was God who did that. It was God ordering the events and turning my course in my race. And I wonder as you lie in your bed at night, perhaps the bed you've slept in for the last 10 years, and you've pondered the future, you realise that next year you may not be sleeping in that same bed. Maybe next year you'll be in a nursing home. Maybe next year you'll be in a hospital bed. But whatever it is, you can know for certain that God is still ordering the course of your race. It's His will for you. The race the Old Testament saints had run, and the race that every New Testament saint has to run, and the race that we are running is a race that has been marked out for each of us by God. Don't fight against it. Don't wish to have someone else's race. The race is God's race given by Himself for you to run. And that's an incredibly sobering and assuring thought to me. And so he comes to his favourite word, run it with perseverance. Run it with steadfastness. Run it with determination. In other words, don't dawdle. Don't meander. Don't be growing weary. Don't be giving up. Don't risk being overcome. Run it with perseverance. It's no good just starting the race all froth and bubble and there's fizzling out to nothing and not finishing. Life isn't a sprint. Life is a marathon. You have to run it with perseverance. And then he adds the last word, not picked up by the NIV, which we'll close with. And he uses a word that lies at the root of our English word agony. And he literally says, run agonizingly. Why? Because the race is hard. And because there are many hindrances. But he's saying, don't give up. Rather, by faith, agonize to persevere to the end and to win the prize. Well, I suppose when we read the letter to the Hebrews, what we have is a letter that indicates how many were running their race in their day. And I wonder if you've ever thought of your life being in that way. Not only that the race is a race that's been set out for you, but that your life is, as it were, a letter. It's a letter presently being written in time, but that one day it will be opened up and read in eternity. One day it will be plucked out from between the leaves of the book of life, and it will reveal how you ran your race. So let me ask you, are you running with perseverance the race set before you? Are your eyes fixed on Jesus? Fixed on the prize, on the goal, on heaven? Is that how you're running? Are you sure of what you hope for and certain of what you do not see, and therefore persevering in the race? May God enable us, by His grace, to put off all that hinders and to persevere in faith unto the end, even as those hordes of witnesses before us have done. And we might do it to the glory of God and His Son, Jesus Christ.